My uncle stood up with a glass of champagne. He smiled at my fiancée, then looked at me. "I still can't believe you picked him." The room laughed. He kept going. "You had doctors chasing you, lawyers, executives, and somehow—" He paused. "You chose the guy who changes brake pads." Even my cousins laughed. I heard forks hitting plates. Nobody looked at me. My face felt hot. I'd heard this joke before, at my high school graduation. Same words, same pause, same laugh. Funny how some people never let you grow up. Then I noticed something strange. Emily wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't angry. She had the calm look she gets grading essays at midnight. The look that means she already knows how this ends. She reached into her purse, slowly, and touched something. An envelope. Thick, sealed. She didn't open it, just rested her hand on top, like you'd rest your hand on a dog that already smelled the storm. That's when it hit me. She knew this toast was coming. Before Richard stood up, I should back up, because the strangeness started before we even left the house. Emily came out of the bathroom in a deep green dress I hadn't seen before, twisting an earring into place. She caught my eyes in the mirror and smiled. Smaller than usual, a little far away. "You ready for tonight?" I asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," she said, reaching into a drawer for something before I could see what it was. I didn't think much of it. We'd been engaged 3 months. Envelopes had become part of our lives. I was wrong not to think much of it. During appetizers, Emily kept glancing at her purse, checking, like something might disappear. She was too calm, too composed for a woman who usually rehearses small talk in the car. Then Grandma refused dessert before it had even been offered. "I'll pass tonight," to no one, and checked her watch twice, like she was timing something. Under the table. She slid a folded napkin toward Emily, who read it and slipped it into her purse next to the envelope. Twice I caught her looking down the table at my grandmother. Not a nervous glance, a question. My grandmother would give the smallest nod back and return to her soup like nothing happened. But something had happened. I was wrong to think it meant nothing. My cousin Daniel leaned toward me. "Don't let Uncle Richard get under your skin tonight." "Why would he?" I asked. He just shrugged. Minutes later, my cousin Priya whispered to her husband, "He promised not to say anything tonight." Promised. I turned that word over for the rest of the meal. I had no idea the answer was already in my fiancé's purse. The restaurant had that low golden light that makes everyone look more in love than they are. Richard waited until the entrees were cleared, then stood, glass in hand. He started beautifully. That was always his trick. He never opened with the knife. He opened with the hand you'd shake first. He told the story of 6-year-old me and the lawnmower I once tried to fix with a butter knife. Everyone laughed. Genuinely this time. He talked about how proud my mother would be tonight if she could see me. My eyes stung a little. I thought, maybe he'll behave. I was wrong about that too. "Ryan always had a big heart," Richard said. He raised his glass toward me. A pause. Practiced. "Unfortunately, heart doesn't pay mortgages." The table went quiet, nobody sure if they were allowed to laugh. Richard let the silence stretch, enjoying it. Then he turned toward Emily. Fully. "I've always believed marriage is about potential," he said, looking her up and down. I just thought Emily's potential was higher. Someone laughed, and that gave everyone else permission. "Some people marry their equal," he said. "Some marry beneath them." He raised his glass toward her like it was a compliment. "I suppose charity still exists." The laugh that followed was the loudest of the night. I forced a smile, the same one I'd been forcing since I was 16. Then I heard a chair slide across the floor. Emily stood up. She set the envelope beside the candle. resting her hand flat on top, same as before. "Before I open this," she said, "I want to ask you 3 questions." The room went still. Even Richard's smile flickered. "Of course," he said, recovering fast. "Ask away." "What makes someone valuable?" He laughed, waving his glass. "Money, success, influence, connections." He counted them off like a grocery list. "If someone quietly helps others," Emily said, "does that count?" Richard shrugged. "Not if nobody knows." That line would matter later. "Last question," Emily said. "Do you remember last Christmas asking me whether Ryan had ever done anything impressive?" Richard blinked, unsure for the first time all night. "I might have?" Emily smiled, small and private, like she was the only one who knew what came next. "I started collecting the answer that night." My stomach dropped. 6 months. She'd been building this, and I hadn't known. I expected Richard to go quiet. He didn't. He laughed instead, and a few people at the far end laughed along, unsure. "Why?" "Emily." He shook his head, smiling. "That's sweet. But a few nice deeds don't change reality." "Character is wonderful," he said, raising his glass. "Unfortunately, banks don't accept character as a mortgage payment." The room laughed again, harder this time. He wasn't losing. He was recovering, turning her own move into a punchline. "So your evidence is—" Richard gestured at the envelope. "Letters? Very touching. I'm talking about building a future, something you can stand on." Emily didn't flinch. "So am I," she said. Then Emily turned to Richard and said something that stopped my heart. "You're right." The room froze. Every breath held at once. My aunt set down her fork. My stomach dropped for an entirely different reason this time. Had I misunderstood everything? Was this her way of letting me down gently in front of my whole family? For one terrible second, I was afraid of Emily. By your definition, success, money, titles, connections, I absolutely could have done better. Then she turned to me, her whole face softening. That's exactly why I chose him. The room exhaled all at once. Somewhere behind me, my grandmother laughed under her breath, quiet, proud, like she'd known this line was coming for months. She had. She'd written it on a napkin. "I want to tell a few stories," Emily said. "Not about me, about him." Every eye turned to me. "Dad," she said, "tell them why the porch mattered." Her father hesitated, jaw tight. "That's where your mother fell," he said quietly. "Broke her hip. The wood was rotted. Nobody noticed until it was too late." He looked at me. "Ryan rebuilt the whole thing before she came home. Told everyone a contractor did it cheap." My ears burned. I never wanted anyone to know that. Story 1. Small. A ripple. Emily turned to her mother, eyes already glassy. "Mom, tell them about the drives." Her voice shook. I never told Emily this. I cried on almost every ride to chemo. I thought it had already beaten me before we got there. She looked at me. "Ryan never tried to cheer me up. He just kept showing up, 38 mornings. He never missed one." I stared at the tablecloth. It never felt like anything at the time. Story 2. The ripple became a wave. "One more," Emily said, her voice cracking, looking at her younger brother. "Tell them what happened when you lost your job." He didn't answer right away. "Someone paid my mortgage. 2 months. Anonymous, through the bank. I never found out who." I watched it land on his face in real time. "That was you?" I could only nod. Story 3. Someone was openly crying now. "There's a 4th, Emily said, and this time she looked directly at Richard. "You'll want to hear this one. 2 winters ago, your neighbor Carol's husband passed. He used to shovel her walk every storm. Someone kept doing it after. Every snowfall, never knocked, never asked to be thanked." Richard's expression shifted. "I know," he said slowly. "I live next to Carol." "I know you do," Emily said. "Ryan lives 4 blocks away." He didn't have anything to say to that. Story 4, the one that made Richard nervous. And the fifth, Emily said, quieter now, is the one that changes everything in this room. Everyone thinks I brought this envelope to defend myself, Emily said, breaking the seal. I didn't. I brought it to defend him. Inside, there wasn't one letter. There was another, and another, and another, a stack that seemed endless. There's one letter I hope I never have to read tonight, Emily said, setting one aside, face down. She didn't explain. First letter. She read only the signature. From my father, silence. Second letter, from Carol. The room had already guessed, but hearing it made it real. Third letter. A veteran from the shelter where I used to volunteer, long before Emily and I met. Richard's smile was gone now. Fourth letter. A teacher thanking the young man who tutored my failing student every Tuesday, never asked to be paid. My aunt started crying. Fifth letter. Emily didn't read it, just held it up. This one's from Grandma. Every head turned. My grandmother folded her hands calmly like she'd been waiting all night. She's the one who helped me find the other letters, Emily said. She's known since February. There it was, the napkin, the clock watching, the refused dessert. My own grandmother, in on it since winter. By the time Emily finished, 20. Letters lay across the table. Parents, neighbors, strangers, people I'd helped and never told a soul about. I've been collecting these for 6 months, Emily said, since the night I overheard you at the country club telling a friend you couldn't wait to give your speech tonight. Richard's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. I almost didn't do this tonight, Emily admitted, voice wavering. Sat in the car 20 minutes before we left. Almost threw the envelope away this morning. She looked at me, not performing anymore. Just my fiancé, scared and honest. But I couldn't sit here again and watch them laugh at the best man I've ever known. Then she reached for the last letter, face down. The one she'd hoped she'd never have to read. This one's mine, she said quietly. I wrote this the week we got engaged. It says if Ryan ever became the kind of man my family wanted, status over, kindness, I would leave. Even at the altar. I'm glad I never needed to read the rest of it, she said, looking around the table. She slid it back into her purse. Richard tried once more, searching for an angle. Well, he said, I suppose that's different. A few kind gestures, right? That's not the same as, no, Richard, my grandmother's voice from the end of the table. She hadn't spoken once all night. Now the whole room turned. It's exactly the same, she said. You just never noticed because you were too busy counting what people have to notice what they give. Nobody laughed. Somebody started clapping. Daniel, I think, and it spread until it wasn't polite anymore. Emily turned to face the whole table, not just Richard. Everyone. You all looked at his paycheck. I looked at the lives he changed. You admired titles. I admired character. You counted dollars. I counted promises kept. She looked straight at Richard. You kept asking why I chose him. A pause. The better question is why more people don't. Richard set his glass down slowly, like it had gotten heavy. Nothing left to argue with. None of it came from Emily. It came from a widow, a veteran, a father with a rebuilt porch, a brother with a saved house, people with no reason to lie. My aunt mouthed, I'm sorry, across the table. Even my cousins, who'd laughed loudest at the brake pad's joke, wouldn't meet my eyes. For the first time in 10 years, Richard looked at me and didn't see a mechanic. He saw the man everyone at that table quietly wished they'd become. The silence lasted longer than any toast that night. Then my grandmother started clapping again, and it spread down the table, quieter than applause for a comeback. Emily reached for my hand, leaned close, and whispered, I told you. One day they'd see. I squeezed her hand back. We didn't talk much on the drive. About 10 minutes out, Emily started crying. Real crying, shoulders shaking. I pulled into a gas station and put the car in park. You did an incredible thing back. There, I said. I know, she said, laughing and crying at once. 6 months sitting on that envelope, hoping I'd have the nerve. What if he never said anything, and I had 20 letters and no reason to read them? You'd have found a reason, I said. She wasn't the woman who'd taken my uncle apart in front of 40 people anymore. Just Emily, exhausted and relieved. I meant every word about choosing you every single day. I need you to actually know it. I told her I did. Since the porch. Since the 38 mornings. Long before I understood what she'd quietly been building. What it left behind by the following week. The porch story had reached my father-in-law's golf buddies. Carol left. A pie on our doorstep with a note. Thank you, in case you didn't already know. Richard skipped Christmas that year and the next. Nobody missed him. Grandma kept Emily's own letter folded inside her recipe box and still pulls it out sometimes, just to remind everyone what it says. Richard once told a room full of people I was just the guy who changes brake pads. He never knew how right he was. Brakes are what keep you from falling. Nobody thanks you for them until the one day you're not there to catch it. 20 people in that room had never had to fall. Not once. Not on my watch. My uncle spent 20 years measuring me by a job title. It took my fiancée 6 months to show everyone what that title had been holding up all along. I'll take it, brakes and all. Here, our story ends. If you like stories of loyalty and true love, subscribe my channel and tell me which part of country you are watching.